Okay, so what I wanted to do this afternoon is initially talk a little bit about the modelling work that I've been involved with in terms of modelling farm system change and impact on greenhouse gases and profitability. I just then wanted to run through a little bit of the sort of economics and costs that farmers are potentially facing. And then we'll have a bit of a chat around forestry and where that fits into the scheme of things. At that stage, I'll then hand back to Harry, who'll talk about soil carbon. And then Harry will hand back to me and we'll have a very brief chat about tools. So anyhow, first thing I just wanted to have a quick talk about, if you like, was the ETS and how that works. Now, many of you may well understand this, but I just wanted to sort of explain it simply so you understand the system and where potentially farmers would sit in the scheme of things. So over here on the right, we've got, mainly in New Zealand, it's the forestry industry that is sequestering carbon in terms of the trees growing. So what happens is at the end of the year, our forester rocks up to government and says, look, I've grown or sequestered 10,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent. So the government says, well done, and he gives them 10,000 NZUs, New Zealand units, okay? So a New Zealand unit is equivalent to 1 tonne of CO2 equivalent. So that's fine, so that happens. Now over on the left here, we've got Fred running his factory, and which is emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Now, he has to account for that to the government. So each year, all industries, including agriculture, have to account to government as to how much CO2 they're emitting, or CO2 equivalents, account for it, and at the moment, the only outfit that doesn't pay for that is agriculture. But anyhow, so Fred over here with his factory, he's emitted 10,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent in that year. So what he does is have a chat to his friend over on the right here and says, can I buy those 10,000 NZUs that I can then use to offset? So money changes hand and the deed is done. And then what Fred does is he comes back to government and says, I've emitted 10,000 tonnes of CO2, here's my 10,000 NZUs to offset, and he surrenders that to the government. Okay, so we have a nice little cycle of life, if you like. So what happens? So the government gives NZUs to the people who are sequestering carbon, who then sell those NZUs to the people emitting carbon, who then account for that and surrender those NZUs back to the government. So we've got a circle. Now there's, paperwork and fees and all that sort of jazz. We're not going to worry about that at the end of the day. Now, in terms of our friends with forestry over here, they don't have to register for the ETS if they don't want to. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. And assuming they are registered for the ETS and they're collecting NZUs, they're under no obligation to sell. Okay? And there's plenty of NZUs sitting in the bank as we speak. But I just wanted to show that, if you like. So where would agriculture fit in the scheme of things? What that means, let's just stick with the farmer one. So in 2025, the point of obligations at the farm level, potentially what farmers will have to do, they're sitting in this camp there. So they either mitigate their emissions through various mechanisms, including growing trees themselves, or they buy NZUs off these guys. Moving on, just looking at some of this modelling. So in terms of average emission levels, if you like, so in terms of the average dairy farm is putting out 9.6 tonnes of biological greenhouse gas per hectare per year. Biological greenhouse gas is methane and nitrous oxide. With a range of, let's say, 3 to 19. So there's a bit of a range there. Now, in terms of that dairy data, or the average comes from a study that Dairy NZ done. They looked at 280 farms which were stratified regionally, So it's actually quite sound. The range comes from both their data and my data. The average sheep and beef farm puts out 3.1 tonnes per hectare per year, and the range is, call that 1 to 5. So again, there's quite a bit of range in there, as you can see, for both farm systems, and that really relates to the intensity of the farming system. Now, just to note, the sheep and beef average and range data there is basically my work. There's only 30 odd farms there. It's not a stratified sample, so it's not as robust as the dairy data. But at this immediate point in time, it's the only stuff that's available. So in terms of talking to your clients, and I'd say 99.9% of them have got no idea they're greenhouse gases, at least you've got a starting point. You've got an average, realising there's a hell of a range around that. The other one I just wanted to show you there, this is the intensity of emissions. Harry talked about that this morning. So this is kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of product. Okay, so for milk solids is pretty obvious. For the rest, it's per kilogram carcass weight. So if you wanted to turn it into kilos of meat, you'd roughly double those figures. But that gives you some idea. And again, in terms of the discussion this morning, I mean, those are good news stories for New Zealand. We are very efficient, up there with the best. The issue, if you like, is in terms of international treaties and where the ETS and the government program for agriculture in New Zealand is heading, we're talking about absolutes, not efficiency. Okay, so that's what your clients are going to be judged on, is their absolute emissions. But the main thing of showing that was just more for interest's sake and pointing out it's interesting, but in the wider scheme of things, it's not particularly relevant because we're really looking at the absolute levels in terms of how the sector's going to be judged.
So how does that compare globally for our competitors?
To those, well, Harry touched on that this morning. So, have you got some specific numbers? Not off the top of my head. But at a technical level, the Yanks and the Europeans are up there with us. If you look at the South Americans or the Indians or China, they're a country mile behind. So just talk about the methodology for this modelling. So the first step, if you like, was to set up the farm system within Farmax. And I trust most, if not all of you, know what Farmax is. In terms of a feed budgeting model that matches feed supply and feed demand, and it brings in the economic, farm income, farm costs component. You then transfer that farm system into Overseer, so you get greenhouse gas and nutrient output. So if you like, you go through and you set up your base farm, you then change the farm system in Farmax, you transfer that into Overseer, and you get your comparison between the base situation, and we'll show you some examples very soon. I then summarised it all in a spreadsheet, and I'll show you that again in a few minutes, really to summarise it in terms of bringing all the scenarios together so you can directly compare them. In a number of instances, we were looking at forestry as an offset. Now, in terms of forestry, what we did was we had our 28, we used pines mostly, 28-year rotation, so you'd set up a 28-year cash flow, discount it back to an NPV, and then you turn that NPV into an annuity, if you like. So let's say your NPV is $5,000 a hectare, you turn it into an annuity, so that'd be 300 odd bucks per hectare per year. So you could compare the forestry annuity with your farm EBIT. It's not 100% accurate, but it's close enough. And then we'd pull that forestry calculation in terms of the CO2 sequestered and the profitability into our little spreadsheet. But just an Overseer, and again, I would say all of you should know what Overseer is, and hopefully the majority of you have been using it, so you know what this is all about. So you open up Overseer FM, and there's a little button up there called GHG. And you pull up, and those are buttons that you can click if you wanted to alter any of the default factors. Unless you really, really know what you're doing, do not change any defaults. Back in the good old days under Overseer 632, the default setting at a farm level for nitrous oxide was wrong, so you had to go and manually and alter it, but under FM that's A, the right default's there, and B, you can't change it anyhow. So that's that. If you then click on the overview button at the end, you bring up another little screen underneath, and again it's got a GHG button, and you click on that and you get to the results. Again, you can't really see this as such, but what it does, if you haven't already looked yourselves, is it gives the greenhouse gas emissions per hectare. So that's methane first, nitrous oxide, and CO2. And it splits it out in terms of the various factors from where they're coming from, and you have a pretty graph out to the right. As I mentioned earlier, we're only interested in the biological greenhouse gas emissions, so that's methane and nitrous oxide. CO2 is interesting, but in terms of our modelling, irrelevant. That's really the CO2 that's embedded in the likes of fuel and electricity and fertiliser and that sort of stuff, which farmers are already paying for, just like all of us in this room have been paying a carbon tax on fuel and electricity for the last 12 years. Which I hope doesn't come as a surprise. Just the point I'd make with Overseer is it calculates, so these figures are in kilograms per hectare, and you add the two together. Overseer works on the sum of the blocks that you put into it. Okay, so if you've got 400 hectare farm and we put in 40 hectare, we've suddenly changed 40 hectares into forestry, it will still work out the greenhouse gas emissions across those 400 hectares. So what you have to do is a little manual calculation to take it back to the greenhouse gas emissions off your pastoral hectares. Follow that? Same issue in terms of FarmAX. FarmAX works off the effective area, which sits there, and that's the magic thing now. You can't change that effective area without paying FarmAX an extra little fee. But let's say we've got our 400 hectare farm and FarmAX, and we've changed 40 hectares into forestry. So you create a 40 hectare block and you zero the pasture growth and then forget it. FarmAX will still work out the profitability over the total 400 hectares. Okay, so you have to do a little manual calculation because your profitability is only on the pastoral side over the pastoral hectares. So just keep that in mind. It's a little trick to think of, and I'll show a little example that showed up in our modelling later. Anyhow, just to move on, now I just wanted to run through this. So this is a spreadsheet I've been using in terms of summarising the modelling work I've done. Now, the spreadsheet's about 40 odd columns wide, so if I put the whole thing at once on the old slide, she'd be microscopic. So I've split it up into various sections, just illustrating. It's in your booklet anyhow. So what we've got here, the first part here, so this is just the physical characteristics of the farm. So this is a dairy farm, so it's 219 hectare dairy farm, running 2.7 cows per hectare, etc. And those are the various scenarios that we looked at. So the next section of the spreadsheet, that's where I put in all my Overseer stuff. So I put in my greenhouse gas emissions. So I've got methane, nitrous oxide, and CO2. So I have got a total there, but then this is the important column, is the biological emissions per pastoral hectare. And then you can we'll put in there the CO2 sequestered by forestry. And again, I'll talk a bit about that later. So we get our net CO2, which is basically our pastoral less our forestry. And then that's just expressed as tonnes per hectare, just to get it back to English instead of talking about thousands of bloody kilograms. And then so that column there is just your percentage change. So how do those scenarios change their greenhouse gas emissions relative to the base? So we've then put in so we've got our total CO2, so that's our net. Now from FarmAX, if you want to, and again, this depends on what you're trying to prove and all the rest of it. So I put in my total kilos of product so I can work out an intensity level for the farm. It's not at a product level, it's just for the farm. And just a little trick to think of, dairy farms produce both meat and milk. So there's that. You then, overseer spits out the nutrients, so we've included that obviously. We've then put in the profitability type data from Farmax, and we can work out so this is change in profit over change in CO2, which is a shadow price if you like. So the smaller that value is, the easier it is to mitigate that carbon. The higher that price is, the more difficult it is to mitigate. So you get negative figures like this. Means the farm should be bloody doing it already because it's got nothing to do with carbon. It's just improving the overall profitability of the farm operation. You then pull in your forestry returns. And as I say, in terms of forestry, you've calculated, you've done your investment cash flow, pulled it back to an NPV, turned that into an annuity. The Manuka figures there based on honey, if you were wondering. And then you just pull it together at an enterprise level. And then in terms of profitability, you've got your change in profitability, which you can then instantly compare back with that change in CO2, which was a couple of slides earlier. Now, the reason for showing you that is in terms of working with your clients, if they're starting to look at farm system change and starting to look at different scenarios, at the end of the day, you probably have to end up doing something similar so you can pull it all together and directly compare your scenarios and walk your clients through that. Now, there's potentially simpler ways of doing that. It just depends on the detail that you want to pull out. But at the moment, as I say, in terms of doing that modelling, Farmax overseer, pull it together in a spreadsheet. As yet, we haven't got one model that does it all in one. Probably never will. So I just wanted to run through now a couple of dairy case studies and a couple of sheep and beef ones, and just, again, sort of walk you through the process. So in terms of the first dairy farm case study here, so this is a Waikato dairy farm, 67.5 hectares, milking 175 cows, 1146 kilos per hectare, putting 128 kilos of nitrogen per hectare per year, on average. So pretty straightforward. So then these were the scenarios that were investigated. So in the first one, we took out all the supplement. Second one, we reduced the nitrogen significantly. Third one, we did both of the above combined. Currently, the farm's rearing around 32% replacement, so we looked at pulling that down to just 15%, sort of bare minimum, if you like. And then the fifth one is that the farm had a few sidelings that weren't producing much pasture, so we said we'll whack them into trees. So in terms of the modelling, I won't go through all of that, but just for that first one there, so what you do is you go into Farmax and you just delete all your imported supplement, and then you'd adjust your cow numbers and or production, whatever, until you pulled it down to a feasible solution. How many of you use Farmax? Several, yeah. That's right, because within Farmax, one of the things it does, it shows when a solution is feasible in terms of supply versus feed demand. So in terms of when we're doing these scenarios, we'd make the adjustment like taking out our supplement, and then we'd adjust our stock numbers and production and all that sort of jazz until we got to a feasible solution. Now we might fine-tune a few little things, but not a lot. We weren't looking to optimise the farm system in the new situation. It was just so long as it was feasible. Now you can use Farmax to optimise, but it takes a lot of iteration back and forth. It's not really an optimisation tool. So we ran through all of these, so each was done individually, and that's the results. So our base farm, if you like, was putting out 11.7 tonnes of biological greenhouse gas per hectare, methane, nitrous oxide. Run through the various scenarios. So in terms of dropping out all our board and supplement, Yes, we reduced our greenhouse gas emissions by 12%. We also dropped our profitability by 5%. Similar negative with fertiliser, reducing our nitrogen fertiliser. I mean, a big reduction in greenhouse gas. When we combine both, we're still compromising our farm profitability. But the interesting thing, it comes back to having run through these, it depends what your target is. Let's say, for argument's sake, we had to get down to reduce our greenhouse gases by 20%. Well, we can do it. We did it in this scenario, and the fact that we dropped our 10% profitability may be the cost of achieving that goal, if you like. Ideally, you're looking at reducing your greenhouse gas and either improving your profitability or at least not compromising it as much as possible. That comes back to a sort of a discussion between you and your clients and you know, bringing your expertise and that to bear. In terms of reducing or rearing fewer replacements, we actually got a direct win-win. So we dropped our greenhouse gas emissions a little bit, less animals, eating less feed, etc. And we also improved our EBIT slightly, less animals, less cost. And in terms of planting the sidelings, yes, we dropped our greenhouse gas emissions. That was particularly, you know, because the trees were working as an offset to some extent. The area planted wasn't big, but something in there. But we also reduced our farm profitability because the profitability, the forestry on those areas was significantly less from the money we were making as dairying. Realising that negative is probably slightly overstated in the sense that in the real world, those sidelings weren't producing as much grass as the rest of the property, so they probably weren't producing the same EFS per hectare. However, it's a bit tricky to do that within the models unless you've got a heap of information. So the model tends to work off the farm average. Hence, that negative, as I say, is probably slightly overstated. And then that's just a graph that, because it always looks better on a graph and it's a bit easier to understand. So in there, the green is your change in your greenhouse gas emissions and your blue is the change in the farm EBIT. So it's just something that's very quick and easy in terms of you know, the farmers recognising, because in essence, what you're really looking is either that or something like that. So you reduction in greenhouse gas at a limited cost. So the second dairy case study here, this is a Canterbury irrigated farm. So we got 217 hectares, milking 763 cows, 1652 kilos per hectare, putting on 221 kilos of nitrogen per hectare, which is pretty well spot on the Canterbury average. And the other thing to remember, the soils were reasonably heavy, all right? So poor as plant available water. So it was a reasonably heavy Canterbury soil. It's not a light, stony one. So when you see the nitrogen leaching figures, you don't need to ask me why they're so low. So the first, there's only two scenarios modelled in this sense, or in this case. The first one was a number of factors really looking at trying to improve the efficiency of the farm. So drop the nitrogen a little bit, increase the cropping area by 9 hectares. So you had that sort of mix of cropping, which is important, but still only a relatively small proportion of the farm, of the diet, if you like. Dropped our stocking rate a little bit of earlier culling, which helps your winter feeding situation. We increased the effluent area significantly, which has a big impact on nitrogen leaching. So that was scenario one. Scenario two, if you like, built on that and brought in further alterations. Dropped supplementary feed a bit further. Improved pasture management, euphemism for the farmer stepped up his grazing management better. A bit tricky to measure that directly. Did a bit of improvement around how the herd was managed. but also reduced the nitrogen fertiliser reasonably significantly in terms of a Canterbury situation. So that's the results, if you like. So the base farm was putting out 13.8 tonnes of greenhouse gas per hectare. In the first situation, we were looking at improving the efficiency of the farm. Yes, we reduced our greenhouse gases, but we also reduced our profitability somewhat. In the second scenario, again, we've decreased our greenhouse gas emissions a bit more, and we've actually had a strong positive in terms of the farm profitability in terms of some of the aspects. However, similar to the earlier farm, that's slightly false positive because as part of this whole thing, the farmer brought in much stricter cost control across his whole operation, which to a certain extent had nothing to do with greenhouse gases. All right? And so it'd still probably have a positive, but if you ignore that, that positive would be much lower. Sheep and beef, first one there. So this is actually a Northland property. 765 hectares effective, bit of forestry, if you like, running 6,500 stock units. As you can see, roughly 60-40 cattle to sheep. The sheep operation was breeding ewes, finishing all lambs. The cattle operation was very much finishing bulls and steers. So in terms of talking to the owners, they're heading down this track anyhow, but they were very keen to set up a 100-hectare techno-beef system. You know, I trust most of you know what a techno-beef system is, but basically it's like more intensively subdivided, and you run your beef herds, sort of small mobs, regular grazings, but at a slightly more intensive stocking rate per hectare, if you like. And they also had 30 hectares of marginal land that they were thinking about planting into pines. So we did those two scenarios individually first, and then went back to the farmers, and they got very, very keen on this because it boosted their profitability significantly, as I'll show you in a minute. So they said, Phil, why don't we double our techno beef area so we'll make more money, but we'll also plant the pines at the same time to help offset in terms of greenhouse gas system. So in terms of the base farm, so the pastoral area was putting out 2.6 tonnes. By the time we brought in our forestry offset, the net was 1.9. So we put in our 100 hectare techno system, and naturally our methane emissions went up because we're running a few more animals, a bit more intensively, all the rest of it. So our net emissions went up to 2.1. So in the percentage terms, our emissions went up 11%, but our profitability went up by 33%. So as I said, they got pretty keen. They weren't too worried about that, but they were very keen on that idea. And in terms of the forestry one, so we planted up our 30 hectares of forestry and used that carbon as an offset against the farm. So we actually dropped our net farm emissions significantly, 37%, and increased our farm EBIT fractionally. And the reason, remembering these are individual ones and they're not cumulative, the reason the farm EBIT went up fractionally under forestry is because the annuity from forestry was fractionally better than the EBIT they were getting from their farming operation. Okay? And then when we combined the two, so we put in our 200 hectares of techno beef plus our 30 hectares of forestry. So again, the net effect was we dropped our farm emissions by 21%, and we were making a lot more money. So they were very happy at that, and that's what they're going to do. And again, it's a nice pretty graph to illustrate exactly what that table just told you. The second case study, and this is Central North Island King Country properties, so 1153 hectares effective, bit of area in pines and manuka and bush, etc. So they're running, whatever that is, about 10,300 stock units. generally a traditional setup, if you like, so that and again, it's the other way, 60-40 sheep to cattle, roughly. The sheep were breeding ewe flock, finishing lambs. The cattle was a breeding cow operation, finishing steers and heifers, plus grazing at some dairy heifers. So what they were interested there was looking at keeping all male progeny from the beef herd as bulls, and plus buying in some weaner Friesians to finish. The centre of the farm was quite steep and rough and not highly productive, so they said, right, well, let's plant 348 hectares into forestry, and we looked at various forestry options in terms of that, and then again, a combination of both. And part of the rationale behind the planting of the steeper land into forestry is that they also own an adjoining block of about 500 odd hectares, which is in forestry, it's leased out, and it's coming back to them in about 5 years after it's been harvested. So they're going to end up with quite a big chunk of forestry land. But purposes of this little example, I've left that 500 odd hectares out. So what happened? Again, if you like, the gross emissions from the pastoral component of the farm is 3.9 tonnes. You bring in the forestry and manuka, you drop that down to a net 2.7. So keeping all the balls as balls, so to speak, and bringing others, we dropped our greenhouse gas emissions a little bit, but we made it more money, which I hope doesn't come as a surprise to those of you that are farming bulls. When we looked at planting the 348 hectares in forestry, obviously, it more than offset. So if you like, we were carbon neutral plus. We actually had a surplus of carbon that potentially we could sell. So we dropped our emissions by 145%, and our farm EBIT dropped by 19. So why did it drop by 19? In this situation, the farm EBIT was in excess of the forestry annuity. So you swap farm animals for forestry, you're actually dropping your profitability. So we've set up, we've planted all our area in forestry, but hello, our methane per hectare has actually gone up. Why is that? Comes back to that pastoral or effective area, you see. We've taken up 348 hectares of the worst of the farm, so we've actually, on the remaining, whatever it was, 700 hectares, give or take, we've actually intensified our operation. So those figures are per pastoral hectare. Okay, so per pastoral hectare, our emissions have actually gone up. So that goes back to like the point I raised right at the start. When you're doing farm action overseas, you've got to just think a little bit exactly what's happening to your effective areas and that sort of jazz. So next couple of slides, what I just wanted to show was a bit of a summary of a range of different modelling that I've been doing, given a number of different scenarios and all the rest of it. And I wasn't going to go into them unless you've got any particular questions. One of the ones I did want to show though was, I put these 4 farms in because on each of them we dropped our stocking rate by 10%. Did we drop our greenhouse gas? Yes, we did. And again, that varies, depends on the intensity of the property when we started. What happened to our farm profitability? Again, that varied. In a couple of instances, as you can see, we made some healthy profits. In the others, we went down a bit. Part of the equation as to why we make money here, and I'm going to explain this again a little bit, is we dropped our stocking rate and increased our per animal production. So we actually improved our profitability, but we compromised some of our reduction in greenhouse gases. Anything else? In-shed feeding with increased cow numbers, both went up. The reason our greenhouse gas went up is because we've got more cows, more feed, a sort of direct linear relationship, if you like. The other one, which always gets queries, is once a day milking. We looked at about 12 or so different scenarios under once a day milking, and they all had different answers. So I just put this in to stir the pot. In this instance, what we did was change from probably a crossbred herd to an all Jersey herd, and we actually increased our stock numbers in order to maintain our production at pretty similar levels to what we'd done previously. So the net result, we actually increased our greenhouse gas a little bit, but we improved our profitability mainly because we'd reduced our costs. I mean, in this instance, we took out at least one labour unit. Just again, some examples from the sheep and beef side of things. Again, interesting. So 4 farms there, we changed the sheep to cattle ratio. Negligible, really, change in greenhouse gas. Variable change in farm profitability. Again, it all comes back to how that farm was operating, the intensity of that farm, and the relative profit between sheep and cattle at the start. Interestingly, the increased lambing. So we had a farm operating at 135%, so we said, well, let's take it to 160 and see what the story is. So when we did that, we ran into a deficit in the winter, all right, because our feed demand in the spring just took off. So what we ended up having to do was reduce our capital U numbers. So I can't remember the exact numbers, but let's say we had 2,000 ewes producing 135%, so we had to drop those to 1,800 ewes producing 160%. So we dropped our capital stock numbers, which reduced our greenhouse gas emissions, if you like, but we had 160%, or what it was, 25% more lambs running around, so we increased our greenhouse gas emissions. So in terms of greenhouse gas, we stayed still, but we increased the profitability of the farming operation. The other one, which I like to do just to my colleagues, so we had a few, 2 or 3 hill country properties, so we said, right, let's just zap all the breeding cows and we'll replace them with bulls and heifers from the dairy industry. Now, I mean, breeding cows are very good in terms of grazing management and all the rest on the hill country. Economically, they're not the greatest animal around. And they're not the most efficient animal around. So if you like, well, the net result, we dropped our greenhouse gas by 8% and increased our profitability significantly. Because in essence, we took what is a relatively inefficient farming system and changed it with probably the best efficiency type systems around. So, trying to sum all this up, if you like, is in terms of, if you look at your on-farm system change, in terms of the impact on greenhouse gas emissions, yes, you can reduce them, but generally it's somewhat limited. So you get, as you can see there, around 2 to 10% reduction. The impact on your farm profitability tends to be vary. In some number of instances, we improved farm profitability. In most instances, we reduced it. So our greenhouse gas reductions, if you like, generally came at a cost. And the real key thing that came out of this is that every farm is different. I can't stand here and say, if you do X, you'll achieve Y, because it depends very much on the intensity of the farm system that you're starting with. And in the real world, it depends very much on the expertise and skill of the farmer in terms of how they handle that change, and particularly how they handle the grazing management. And then just to move on, this is an arable farming example. There's maize in the Waikato. And there's few key things, if you like. The first thing you notice, there's no methane because there's no animals, okay? So the main greenhouse gas emission from our arable farming is nitrous oxide, which is directly related to the amount of nitrogen fertiliser that we put on. Now, you certainly get CO2 from various sources, so these are sort of embedded CO2, if you like, which is already being accounted for within the system. Now, in terms of when you cultivate a paddock and turn the old soil over, a lot of the organic matter in the soil oxidises and you get a lot of CO2 emitting. Now, Harry's going to go into that in a lot more detail shortly when he talks about soil carbon. The short story here is, yes, we're emitting CO2 from cultivation, but it's not in the ETS and it's not accounted for. So, short story, in terms of arable farming, just to repeat the obvious, it really comes back to nitrous oxide, which relates to nitrogen fertiliser. Now, I'll run through, this has changed a little bit given what Harry announced this morning and the government's decision. Up till yesterday, if you like, the choice in terms of the point of obligation for the ag sector is who paid the tax in the first instance, and the option that was on the table yesterday was the processors. Okay, so that's now off the table unless the industry doesn't pull its finger and achieve its voluntary gains, in which case it's going to be very quickly back on the table. So I'll run through this just to explain it anyhow. So in terms of if the point of obligation is at the processor level, what that means, going back to my little circular diagram on the ETS, is they would have to stand in the market and buy NZUs to offset those farm level emissions, which would be related to their throughput. So that means, Fonterra and Sinlay and Open Country and Silver Fern Farms, etc., would all have to do that. So they would have to buy NZUs to offset their farmer emissions. That's going to cost them money. So obviously they're going to turn around and say, it's cost me $5 million to buy these NZUs. I'm going to trim the schedule accordingly so to make that money back. And then just to give you an indication of how that would work, what we've got here, this is for beef. So that's the price of carbon, and that's the percent liability. Now, at the moment, as we've talked about, the price of carbon is $25 and capped through to June next year. As of about 10 o'clock this morning, it was actually $24.82, but anyhow, let's call it 25. The other one, and again, Harry's talked about this in terms of the percent liability. So what the government said is that when agriculture comes into this system, they will face 5% liability. The other 95% will be sucked up by the good old taxpayer. But anyhow, it's a bit of sensitivity. So if you like, $25 and 5% liability, that would be about 2 cents per kilogram off the schedule. Sheep meat, it's 3 cents. The dairy payout is 1 cent. So, number of things there. Firstly, it's very small. Secondly, it would be invisible because it'd be gone before the farmer sees it. So it's not a great incentive to do much change because you're not really aware of it. The other thing, of course, is if you get out at $100 and 100% liability, it would be 88 cents, and you probably notice an 88 cents disappearing off your payout. Yeah. Now the other one is the point of obligation at the farm level, and as Harry said this morning, the intent is that will happen in 2025. So again, it depends how the allocation happens and all the rest of it. That's unknown at the moment. What I've assumed here is that it's just an equal allocation, so every farm has to do the same. Once you tell me what the allocation approach is, I can adjust accordingly, but we'll stick with this for the time being. So the idea here is the farmer's liable for their emissions, and the figures here are based on no offsetting and all that sort of jazz, depending on what the farmer does. So they would have to stand in the market and buy NZUs to cover their emission cost. So for the average sheep and beef farm, and this goes back to that 9.6 and 3.1 tonne average figures, that's what I've used these figures on. So $25 and 5%, it's $4 per hectare. For the average dairy farm, it would be about $12 per hectare. Now, if you do your maths, the average sheep and beef farm is about 640 hectares. That's $2,500. The average dairy farm is 151 hectares, so that's about $1,800. So that's the total cost. Now, again, you could argue, in the scheme of things, that's not a big cost. It's a dead weight cost, obviously. And if the farmer has to write out a cheque at the end of each year for this, there is something of a motivating factor because it'll piss them off. The other thing just to think on is you could argue, $12 is survivable. Let's go to the extreme. If this came in tomorrow at $100, 100%, the average farm couldn't handle it. And in terms of, and same with the average sheep and beef farm. That's just a direct tax. But the average sheep and beef EBIT's probably slightly less than that. So who knows how things will go, and it's not going to come in tomorrow, obviously. But it does give some indication, and so it depends whether that $25 cap comes off, or whether the government looks at, they might let it rise a little bit and then recap it. Who knows? The other thing, just while you're thinking about this, everyone, in terms of the $100, the Productivity Commission did a study, whenever it was, about 18 months ago, around all, climate change and New Zealand's obligations and all the rest of it. They assumed a starting carbon price of $250. NZIER, and all the NZIER work was quoted in the zero carbon discussion document. They started at $400. Now, our pastoral industry just wouldn't survive at that. But anyhow, we'll see how time goes on. The other thing you need to think about is when all this happens, and I'm not sure where this wasn't in the press release, but it might be in the detail, is that as we've talked about, if you put on nitrogen fertiliser, you'll end up with some nitrous oxide emissions. So the government's going to bring in a tax on nitrogen fertilisers. Now that will be on all nitrogen fertiliser. There's different emissions, if you like, but they've split nitrogen fertiliser into three. So you've got urea without urease, urea with urease, and every other nitrogen fertiliser. Okay, and they've each got their little different emission factors there. What I've done here is just use urea because that's by far the main nitrogen fertiliser used. So at $25 and 5% liability, there'll be a tax of, there'll actually be a tax of $2.92 per tonne of urea. Now, a tonne of urea costs, last time I checked a week ago, was about $616 a tonne at the works. So another $2.92 is nothing. About 2 years ago, we were paying $950 for a tonne of urea. And if you look at the sales figures, it didn't slow down whatsoever. So it comes back to the question that was raised, or the issue raised earlier about tax on smoking and all the rest. How effective a tax is depends very much on the elasticity, what's called the elasticity of demand, which is how much demand alters according to the price. You do the analysis on nitrogen fertiliser, it's reasonably inelastic. And part of that is, why do we use so much nitrogen fertiliser, or why do our farmers use so much nitrogen fertiliser? Because it's the cheapest supplementary feed by a country mile. It's about half the cost of most of the next alternative. But watch the space. I mean, my assumption, without reading the detail, is this will come in pretty smartly. And the same with lime. When you apply lime onto the ground, it will let off some CO2. So you're going to get taxed on that as well. Again, $25 and 5%, it's not much, 55 cents per tonne. Get down to this end of the scale, you're probably not going to be putting much lime on if you're paying $110 a tonne tax. The other interesting thing, if you like, the original proposition was in terms of agriculture coming into the ETS in a broad sense, was that, and at the $25 a tonne, 5% liability, is the money raised would be recycled in terms of R&D and extension and all that jazz. My understanding under the proposal, and Harry can correct me, is what's being proposed now is that's not going to happen.
Well, there wouldn't be any money to recycle.
Well, there'll be none until 2025.
But the sector has said it will ensure adequate funding for the things that need to be done between now and then. So the onus comes onto the sector to resource it.
Exactly. So watch your levies. Now, I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about stocking rates because in some quarters this is the magic potion, if you like. If we reduce our stocking rates, our problems are solved. So as Harry's talked about this morning, there's a direct relationship between dry matter intake and methane. Okay? So just to give a little example, I've got 400 cows producing 160,000 kilos of solids. I dropped both by 10%, so I've now got 360 cows producing 144,000 kilos of solids. My methane production, or emissions rather, has dropped by 10%. So I've solved my problem. right? Might have trashed my financial bottom line, but I've solved my methane problem. Pretty straightforward, really. However, I'm sitting there looking at my 360 cows in my farm and I think, there's a bit more grass out there that I can eat. I don't really like seeing that go to waste. So I'll leave my 360 cows at 360, but I'll increase my per cow production to soak up that additional feed. So let's say, for example, my 360 cows are now producing 160,000 kilos. In other words, my production's gone back to where I started from. So now I'm eating a lot more feed. My methane emissions relative to my base have gone down about 2%, okay? Which is really the maintenance cost of those cows that I no longer have. But the other 8% that I'd got previously has gone out the wind because I've increased my dry matter intake to achieve that. Now, in doing that, I've done wonderful things to my financial bottom line, but I'm really trying to get my methane and nitrous oxide down. So dropping stocking rate and dropping production together will give you that methane reduction. If you drop your stocking rate and then increase your per animal production, you're boosting your greenhouse gas emissions back up again. So at the end result, as I say, you might get a slight reduction because your maintenance costs have gone down because you've got less animals, but only partly. All the rest has been absorbed back up because you're eating roughly the same amount of dry matter. The other thing, just to think on this, and certainly we've had farmers do this. Some of them have done it very successfully, others much less so, and it really comes down to how well that farmer manages their grazing management at a lower stocking rate. Because they need to step up their game. If their grazing management is a bit lax, they'll lose pasture quality and they'll start to spiral down. Because lower pasture quality, production's going to drop, so on. And then part and parcel of this was this question around optimisation. And again, the argument is, if we optimise our system, we can reduce our stocking rates, reduce our greenhouse gases, and improve our profitability. Now, which is true in a sense, but, and there's a whole heap of buts. So what we've got here is a profitability curve. So we're operating at point A, which is over the top of the curve. So if we reduce our stocking rate, reduce our feeding level, we'll reduce our production. But that's fine. We're moving back up the curve to B. At point B, we've reduced our greenhouse gas emissions, we've reduced our nutrient discharges as well, and we're making more money because we've improved the efficiency of the farm operation. So we've hit nirvana. The problem is, this is a point in time exercise. As soon as I change any of my input or output costs and returns, that point B changes. And that happens on a very regular basis in farming. Just think, payout changes. If you did this a week ago when the payout was 675, you get point B. The payout's now 705. That point B's now changed because my input returns have altered. So your point B moves around within a year, and it absolutely moves around between years. And a classic example there is, if you look at the Fonterra payout over the last 15 years, the standard deviation between the opening price and the actual final price is $1.55 within the year, okay? So that's a hell of a variation, and all of you understand the difference between the payout between years. So what we get is, so we've got our optimum point moving around regularly, if you like. Now, you could sit at point B if you wanted to buy and sell animals and shift your input costs and all that around on a weekly basis. I'm yet to meet a farmer that really wants to do that. So if you look at this situation where your optimum point's moving around, what you do is you design your farm system that is around that optimum. So that for most of the time you're around the optimum, but not necessarily at the optimum, if you follow that. But to me, that's probably the most practical approach you can take. So again, this idea that we can all suddenly shift our farms up to an optimal point is good in theory, but in practice it doesn't really work. So What can we do? Methane. As has been pointed out, there's a direct relationship between methane production and dry matter intake. So if we want to reduce our methane by 10%, all we have to do is cut our stock rations from 100% to 90%. Okay, so we'll starve them a little bit more than we usually do. That's not a recommended farm management practice. So you look at the next proxy is around altering your stocking rates and production. And as I've just been talking through, that's not necessarily straightforward. Yes, if you drop your stocking rate and your production by 10%, you'll get a 10% reduction in methane. But you've probably whacked your financial bottom line to a fair degree. The other one is around planting trees, and we've talked about that a little bit. In the zero carbon bill at the moment, farmers are not allowed to offset methane production by growing trees, which is a bit of a nuisance, given that, as I said, about 80% of our emissions are methane. Now, this is where you get a bit cunning. There's a little thing called money, so you can still offset it. What you do is, I'm emitting, let's say, 1,000 tonnes of CO2 as methane over here, so I grow a forest over here that grows 1,000 tonnes of CO2, or sequesters 1,000 tonnes of CO2 every year. I sell that carbon and use that money to pay my tax on my methane. So then we've got these other options that Harry mentioned this morning in terms of genetics, which is positive in a sense because genetics are very permanent. And then we've got things like these vaccines and inhibitors hopefully coming over the horizon, any time in the next decade or 2 or 3 or 4. Well, if all else fails, we'll just feed seaweed. Now, in terms of nitrous oxide, there are things that you can do to fine-tune it. Again, as Harry discussed this morning, you can look at the diet. You have to make some big changes to adjust that. As you're aware, there's a lot of interest in plantain. Now, Dairy NZ are running a big project in the Tararua, looking at trying to maintain 30% of the farm in plantain, which is a farm systems issue, if you like. That's a big ask, but I mean, you've got to try these things. Certainly farmers have been using plantain. I mean, I know some guys have used plantain for a long time to finish lambs. It's usually lasts about 2 to 3 years before they have to undersow again. Others have tried it and it's failed. But it's there as an option. The other issue, of course, is how you can prove that you've got 30% of your farm, or 30% of the diet rather, is plantain. I'd argue most farmers have got no idea how much clover they've got in their pasture, let alone trying to count plantain. The other one is around looking at reducing your nitrogen fertiliser, or at least improving the efficiency of your nitrogen fertiliser usage. And again, that has big spin-offs in terms of the freshwater component. And hence, again, we've got some case studies where some farmers have been putting a lot of nitrogen fertiliser on in June and July, which is a reasonably dumb thing to do from several directions. So you take that out and alter the farm system accordingly. The other one is plant trees. You can still offset your nitrous oxide by planting trees. Pretty straightforward. You can still, if you reduce your stock numbers in production, again, you have an impact on your nitrous oxide emissions. And again, as we've discussed, there's this question of genetics and whether over the long term we can breed for a lower nitrogen in the urine emitting animal, which reduces nitrates and nitrous oxides. But at the moment, the toolbox, as you can see, is somewhat thin. So that farmers at the moment are looking at reasonably limited options other than land use change, which is really around trees. So to a certain extent, we're still very reliant on research to come up with some more sort of better or permanent solutions. And as Harry, if we get a vaccine that'll take out 30+% of our methane, well, that's a big chunk of the problem gone. But I just included there at the bottom, the first step. Almost all the farmers I've talked to, and I've talked to several farmer groups, none of them have really known what their greenhouse gas emissions are. And it was interesting, I was talking to a group of farmers in Northland recently, and we made sure they'd got their figures before they came along, and we put them all up on the board, and they were all underneath the average, so they were very pleased with themselves. But that's really a first step, and in terms of, if you've got an overseer file, you've got the greenhouse gas figures there, all right?